So, by the way, he calls the fourth gospel, alternatively, he calls it the fourth gospel, the John's gospel. He sometimes talks about the fourth evangelist, meaning the author of the fourth gospel. But he means basically that the last one to be written, the Gospel of John, as we normally call it. So is this then the point, he says, at which the fourth evangelist comes to our aid? Can the testimony of the fourth gospel to be called in to give that clearer answer? Did Jesus think he was the divine Son of God? Certainly John's answer seems clear enough. A regular feature of Jesus's discourses in the fourth gospel. The discourses, by the way, are these long, often rambling talks that Jesus gives in the fourth gospel. They go on for chapter after chapter. You don't get them anywhere else. Precisely, he says, in these long discourses, we find Jesus talking of God as his Father and of himself as God's Son. He calls God Father more than 100 times and himself Son 23 times. For the first time, we find one of the key words of the later creeds that later creeds use of Jesus, monogenes in the Greek, translated usually as only begotten. Not only in the prologue, it's there in the opening verses of John, but also in one of Jesus' discourses. Linked with the Father-Son theme, this whole Father-Son theme is very, very dominant in the fourth gospel. It's not really dominant in the earliest gospel, say, of Mark. But linked with the Father-Son theme is the regularly expressed conviction of his own pre-existence. So Jesus existed prior to his coming into being born of Mary, of course. He existed with the Father in heaven. And here's a bunch of quotes here from the gospel, which I won't repeat. Of his descent from heaven, another bunch of quotes. Of his coming into the world, coming from God, and so on. The climax is probably reached in the most powerful of the I am sayings. These are the amazing I am sayings. I am the light of the world. Before Abraham was, I am the resurrection, I'm the light, I am the good shepherd, etc. Only found in the fourth gospel. And the one he refers to, the most powerful, is where Jesus claims to pre-existence, where Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am. This is 8:58, John 8:58. Clearly, Jesus was with God or even was God. So a clear enough picture emerges, he says. But can we assume that John's intention was to give these various expressions as utterances of the historical Jesus? Can we assume that John's concern was to paint a portrait of Jesus as he actually was, to record, like a faithful stenographer or some with a YouTube channel, what he actually said? The reassertion of the fourth gospel as a historical source and the renewed realization that its tradition has firm historical roots, at least at several places, gives some encouragement on this score, because you'll often hear Christian apologists say, well, in recent years, the Gospel of John has been seen by scholars as much more historically reliable than it used to be heretofore, say, in the early 20th century or the 19th century. And in some places, this is true, let's say with, say, archaeology or cultural references in the Gospel of John. But, and this is the but, unfortunately, Jimmy Dunn continues, however, it is precisely at the point which concerns us, meaning did Jesus think he was divine, Son of God, that the case is weakest. Precisely here that the indications are strongest, that John is presenting us with a developed rather than original tradition. So in other words, the words given to Jesus on his lips in the fourth gospel are not really historical. They are the product of a much later developed tradition. Then Jimmy Dunn says, consider the following points. And he mentions 3 points, which is the whole point of the video, which we will now explore. And they're a little bit, some of them are a bit technical, but let's go through them. And he mentions, first of all, Dodd, a guy called Dodd. He was a British New Testament scholar in the 20th century. Dodd's careful comparison of the Gospel of John and the Synoptic Gospel has indeed brought to our attention several sayings and sequences of sayings which most probably stem from synoptic or synoptic-like tradition. So in other words, there were some themes or words in, say, Mark or Matthew and Luke, which we will see examples in a second, which were then developed, taken over by John, and hugely reworked and expanded and elaborated and embellished. I think basically that's what he's trying to say. But Dodd has also highlighted still more clearly how distinctive are the Johannine discourses, John's discourses, which make use of those sayings, constructed to a characteristic pattern which has no parallel in the Synoptic Gospels. No one can dispute that the vast differences between the discourse style in John's Gospel and Jesus' teaching in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So there still is a huge difference between John on the one hand and Matthew, Mark, and Luke on the other. The point is this, and Dunn really goes to the detail now. The point is this, and this is where it's so compelling, I think, that I don't see how anyone can disagree with what he's saying, because it's so obviously factually correct what Jimmy Dunn is saying. And everyone agrees, virtually everyone agrees in the world, in academia, with what he's saying. The point is this, that the style is so consistent in John. So the way Jesus speaks, the language he uses, the themes that he articulates in John is so consistent. It never changes. It doesn't matter, from page to page to page, whether in Galilee or in Judea, or whether Jesus is speaking to crowds or to individuals, to peasants or to Pharisees, to disciples or to hostile Jews. And so consistently different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that it can hardly be other than a Johannine literary product. In other words, this style has to be an invented product of the last gospel, John, developing and shaping the tradition according to a pattern largely imposed upon it. So John takes themes which were around much earlier and then works, develops, embellishes them massively to create these huge discourses we see in John. And John imposes this theme on the earlier material. The best explanation still remains, says Jimmy Dunn, that John's discourses are meditations or sermons on individual sayings or episodes from Jesus' life, but elaborated in the language and theology of subsequent Christian reflection. So in other words, they're highly embellished sayings. He seems to be saying Jesus didn't go around saying, I am the light of the world and so on. No earlier tradition has Jesus speaking like this. But he takes themes, the little pinpricks, little suggestions, hints in the earlier Gospels, and massively develops them, like a sermon, like a preacher would, embellishing them, exaggerating them, advancing them massively. And this is the standard understanding, as I keep on saying.